Hello and welcome to our location number 1 investigation reveal. So this is a reminder, we went to Hibernia, New Jersey into the Hibernia mine, which you can still go to at this time. And then we did a sit-down mediumship investigation at St. Patrick's Cemetery, which is actually right in the middle of the mining area. So this picture on the left is a mine that was in Hibernia or Rockaway, which is right nearby. This picture is from about the 1900s to 1920s, so kind of in that time frame that we're looking at. And as a reminder, this is the map of the mines at about 1907. You can see that on the bottom. And where we were, so see where that word tunnel is? That's where that big mine opening was. We hiked all the way up and we did our mediumship in where that square is. It says CEM. So that's the cemetery, which is literally to the left of the entire mining highway, which is incredible. So, just keep that in mind, and also notice that it says Andover Mine here. We're going to keep that in mind as well. So 2 of the women that we encountered were named Miranda and Angelica. And what they gave us was some really great information about life around the mine. And I'm going to play 2 clips first from Miranda and the second from Angelica.
My general impression from what her message was is that she really wanted to relay that she loved her life here and she loved what she did. She loved cooking. She loved being in her house. She loved being with her children. She loved being here. But it was like dirty and like not safe. I don't really know. But she made a point of cooking, soot, and an accident. And she died at 48. From, I think, Czechoslovakia? It's not Russia. She says, oh no. like that was insulting. Got the name Angelica. She's really pretty. Like a younger woman. Younger, like 16, 18? No, 16's too young. 18, 22, but she doesn't, something with her face, domestic abuse.
Oh no.
So just as some background information to what Hibernia was like at this time, there was a mine there, and it actually dates back into the 1700s. And it had switched many different mine owners, this whole line of mines, different owners, different time frames. Sometimes it was active, sometimes it wasn't, but there was always a mine there from the 1700s. And the individuals that I contacted on during this trip were in general from about the 1880s to, I would say, the 1920s. They were kind of in that time frame of living there. And originally, a lot of the mine workers were Englishmen, Scottishmen, and Irishmen, but actually with these accents, there were Czechoslovakians, or Slovaks as they were known back then, who started immigrating into the area around the 1850s and were working in these mines. So that immediately explains why Miranda and Angelica both had different names and they had the accent. And in the 1880 census, there were about 1,700 people living in Hibernia, which is actually a really large number of people for a town back then, a rural town back then. And they were all miners. And as Miranda and Angelica kind of gave us an idea of, is it was dirty and it was dangerous. So this is actually 2 clips from 2 different recorded interviews. One was taken from a gentleman named Uncle Hiller, and the interview was recorded in 1978. And in his interview, he specifically said, Hibernia was just a small mining town while I was growing up. Most people had chicken coops and pig pens. There was no indoor plumbing. Not too long ago, one of my cousins asked me if I'd like to go back to those times, and I said, no way. It was kind of a dirty old place. When I read that, I was like, oh my God, like that's the first thing that he used to describe it. Like not, oh, it was boring. Oh, there was nothing to do. Oh, there was no electricity. It was smelly. He literally described it as a dirty old place. And that's pretty much exactly what Miranda said, that it was dirty and sooty. And then on the right hand side is an interview from a gentleman named Mr. McCabe, and was recorded in about the 1950s. And he was a gentleman that did work in the mines, so he's about 15 years old. And he said that Rockaway Township, including Hibernia, were plenty wild in my day. Fighting, he said, seemed to be a pastime. I've seen 100 fights there in a night. And it didn't take much to start one. So I also read another article that was talking about how a lot of these miners didn't really save up a lot of their money that they were making, a lot of their wages, because there were saloons in the area, and they were spending a lot of their money at the saloons and drinking alcohol and getting into fights. And there were ethnic fights and ethnic arguments and gangs. So it did kind of make sense that if there was a lot of, external violence, that it is with alcohol involved, it could have happened that Angelica could have suffered domestic abuse, and that could have been why she had passed away, was domestic abuse influenced by excessive alcohol consumption. So this is a picture of an iron ore crusher in Lower Hibernia, which was very close to where we actually did our investigation. And as you can see, I know this is a black and white photo, but as you can see, it just kind of looks dreary, right? Like it's black and sooty and dirty and just nothing really going on. It just kind of looks dreary. So that would explain a lot of the different reasons that they described it as unsafe and dirty. So one other thing that was interesting about Miranda, well, two things, was she talked about having 5 children and only 3 of them surviving. So when I started looking at the cemetery records of St. Patrick's Cemetery, it was shocking. It was about, I would say, a third to a fourth of all the burials that were recorded in the cemetery were infants and children. And I will show a picture of just a sample of the cemetery record in a minute, but it was really shocking. So it's definitely believable that she had had those children, and then 2 of them had passed away really young. I will say I was not able to find, excuse me, a Miranda or Angelica in the cemetery record, but it was also very common in that time frame for immigrants to actually take American names. So there were many, many, many Marys and Margarets in the record, and I'll show you those as well. And there were also a lot of Annas and Annies that were in the record that Angelica could have changed her name to, and Miranda could have changed her name to. But again, I didn't find them specifically, but they definitely could have adopted different names and have been buried under those names. So now we're going to go on to our next individual that we encountered, and his name was David, and he died in a mining accident. So I have 2 clips of from our original video that we're going to go over.
David. He's a troublemaker. I'm getting head pain. Head pain from here, both sides. I'm getting that this gentleman was younger. Head trauma, both sides, mostly the right side. Mostly this side, right here. Head trauma. Did you get shot? No. Trauma. That's weird. I mean, there were mines here. Was it a mine accident? It happened in a mine. Did something fall on your head? No response. He doesn't really want to talk to you, but he was a troublemaker. Okay, Thank you. I get that message that that's how you died. You can release that pain.
Are you feeling anybody that was buried here, or just people wandering?
Miranda is here. David is here, but David does not have a grave. Like he doesn't have like a really nice, like he may not have a marker. Miranda does.
So this was one of the craziest things I think I have yet encountered. And although I found a lot of evidence in other places, but there was a significant mining accident in the Hibernia mines, October 19th, 1911. And actually 12 men drowned in the Hibernia mine. And what happened is there were about 60 men in one of the mine shafts that went down about 1,600 feet below the surface of the earth. And they were making a new mine next door. And because there were poor maps and poor management, they actually blasted through this mine, broke all the timbers, the supporting timbers, and the mine flooded. So the men who were in the upper levels of the mine survived, and there were 12 men who were in the lower levels of the mine who did not survive, and they died by drowning after the blast. And it was crazy, but the foreman of those 12 men, his name was David Slight, and he died in the mine. Surprisingly, he was the only American. All the rest of them were immigrants, but he was a foreman. And this is a snapshot of the St. Patrick's Cemetery record. I took a snapshot of it, and this shows David Slight's burial record. So again, October 19th, the date that it happened, 1911, and he was actually 28 years old when this happened. So that would still go along with the idea that he was young. 28 is still considered young in my book. So he was younger. I didn't say he was super, super young, and I didn't say he was old. I said he was younger, and he was a white male. And I also said he was a troublemaker, and it was oftentimes that these foremen, and I read this, that the foremen would actually learn the language of their workers because they were the translators between the managers, what the managers wanted, to the foreman, to the workers. So it could have been that he was kind of being a prankster with us, and he was saying his name with an accent, but the rest of the stuff he said to me, it wasn't in an accent, it was just his name. And, looking at the records, it never in the newspaper records could I find that they had actually found or retrieved the bodies. I did find a record from December 1912, no, it still would have been 1911, from December 1911 that said they still hadn't recovered the bodies. So it is possible that this burial record is just a marker, and he doesn't actually have a grave because they never recovered his body, but it's possible. So 2 other things of note, actually, just on this small little record of St. Patrick's Cemetery burial records, is you will find 1, 2, 3 Marys with still foreign last names. But there are, like I said, there were many Marys. Oh, there was 4 actually. I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4 Marys that were recorded in this one little section. And there's an Annie. So like I said, there were many Annies, there were many Marys, and it is possible that the other 2 women had changed their names. And also I want you to note here is when you just look at these ages, again, this is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 records here. 1, 2, 3 of these records were infants that had passed away. So again, it is possible, and it would make sense that Miranda could have lost her children at the time she did. So going on to the last individual that we saw, and this again was incredible, and I think we got some really, really great evidence. So these are clips about the mine manager.
The gentleman walking around is the manager. He managed the mine.
Really?
Yep. He was the manager.
His name was David?
No, David worked in the mine. Yes, the gentleman walking around was the manager. He's white, has a mustache. I also feel like he has he doesn't really want us to see him. He walks like this. looks around like he's examining and watching and seeing. And he has a hat, tweed, big, like a round guy. He's round, very round. 50s, 50, 58, 60, early 60s. He walked the perimeter. Let me ask if he leaves the cemetery. He does leave the cemetery. He doesn't really like to, because he doesn't really like to leave the cemetery because these are his workers. Why is he still trying to manage them? Oh, he's sending pain down my back. All right. Why do you still feel like you need to watch your workers? What I do best. Where are you actually buried? I'm getting 2 words, an M word, and then Ringwood. Where are you actually buried? What is your name? He snorted. He's like, I'm not giving you that.
This is somebody else than the manager?
No,
this is still the manager.
This is still the manager. He's the. I can imagine somebody would see him, like a person who is having an experience, like comes here and sees like not a shadow person, but like somebody moving out of the corner of their eye. I can imagine they would see him.
Okay.
So after going back and looking at the information I had from this mine manager, he didn't give me his name, but he did say he was a mine manager, specifically mine manager, not the mine owner, not the mine operator, not a mine worker. He said he was the mine manager, and he also gave me the word Ringwood. So now I had 2 pieces of information to go on, and this whole took me down a whole rabbit hole, and we're going to get to it. But turns out there is a Ringwood, New Jersey, and there is a place in Ringwood called Ringwood Manor. This place is still in existence, and it was originally built in the 1700s. And the first family who lived on this property, and at the time it was still called Ringwood Manor, were mine owners and mine managers. And Ringwood is known to be the home of many great iron masters, starting from the 1700s all the way up into the 1900s. They were the top crust aristocrats of the time, and some of the family names were Hasenclaver, Erskine, Ryerson, Cooper, and Hewitt. So there is a record of a gentleman named Robert Erskine who is buried on the property in Ringwood Manor. He lived in Ringwood Manor, and he's buried on the property, and he was a mine manager, and he managed the Hibernia mines and the Ringwood mines. Now, this gentleman was actually buried in the 1700s, and according to how this gentleman looked to me in the cemetery, I don't think this is the gentleman, because the time frame of his attire was not correct. But what's interesting is Robert Erskine was he worked for George Washington, and he was a map surveyor, so he's actually really famous, and there are books written about him, and you can actually still go and visit his grave. And this is a picture of his grave, Robert Erskine's grave at Ringwood Manor on the property. But as I was looking through additional history of mine managers living at Ringwood Manor, there's a gentleman named Philip R. George, and he was a mine manager for Ringwood Mines and the Andover Company, which was the actual section of the mining at that point in time, which is right by that cemetery that I showed you right in the beginning. And he managed these mines for 35 years. And he was a very well-known mine manager, very well respected. And he made the Cooper and Hewitt Company a lot of money. And he was kind of the right-hand man. And he actually built a house on Ringwood Manor's property. He actually got in trouble because he spent so much money on it. But anyway, he built a house on Ringwood Manor's property, and which is now still standing. It actually serves as the Ringwood Municipal Building. And he died there. So he died in Ringwood, on Ringwood Manor, in Ringwood Manor. He died of pneumonia when he was actually 68 years old, and that was in 1888. He was known to be a very strict mine manager, but he also was known to be very fair and effective. So his brother is another mine manager. They kind of worked together, and his name was Richard George. He was younger, and he died. So Richard George died in 1905 when he was 76 years old, and he is known to be buried in Dover, New Jersey, and there is actual record of him being buried in Dover, New Jersey. So what's really interesting about this, he is, historians don't actually know where Philip R. George is buried. So I am not the first historian to try and find out more information about this gentleman. So there's a very famous historian who's now passed, but his name was Lewis P. West, and he collected all kinds of information about Ringwood Manor, about Ringwood, and about the mines. He has volumes and volumes and volumes of newspaper articles and clippings of that time frame that he has kept and has been passed down. So he actually in the 1980s tried to find evidence of where P.R. George was buried. And so him and his friend, Mr. I'm going to butcher this, but Trusowitz, they wrote letters to different cemetery and historical societies in Boonton, New Jersey, because according to P.R. George's death certificate, he is buried in Boonton, New Jersey. So Lewis P. West asked these Boonton cemeteries to find out information. And it turns out, looking at this cemetery record, which is a cemetery record of one of the cemeteries in Boonton, New Jersey, there are 2 plots that were purchased by R. George and P. George. So R. George, I would guess, would be his brother Richard George, and P. George would be Philip R. George. Now, what happens is when somebody is buried in one of these plots, it will then be recorded as perpetual care, meaning that the individual is in the ground is perpetual care of that individual. So what's curious is that neither R. George or P. George have been recorded as being perpetual care. So there's actually no record of either of those gentlemen being buried in those plots. Now, we know Richard George is buried in Dover, New Jersey, and there is a record of that. But there is zero record of where P. George has been buried. So this is a picture of Philip R. George, courtesy of Lewis P. West. And it is very possible that this gentleman has been secretly buried at Ringwood Manor. He worked his whole life for the individuals who lived at Ringwood Manor. He built a beautiful home for himself at Ringwood Manor. And it's possible that he chose to be buried there secretly on the property. So I was so excited to find out all this information, and I feel really good that we found the mine manager, we found David, and I'm so glad to be here to tell their story and of their history and of these 2 locations. If you have any questions about these locations or any questions about the information that we uncovered, please email me. It is ghosthistorymedium@gmail.com. Also check out my website and at ghosthistorymedium.com. And I can't wait to share with you our second location reveal. That will be coming up soon. We also have some pretty great documented evidence of the individuals that we found there.